Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place. Ljóðsbið gallar helgarkindir, meiri og minni mógu heimdalar, vild what valfóður well fram teljak, fornspjól fyrra þás fremstum mann. What I've just recited is the first stanza of a poem called Våluspá, the first poem recorded in the Poetic Edda. And although we don't know exactly how these poems would have been recited and performed, I've done my best here to portray a style that I think makes sense, where the alliteration is accentuated and the vocal style is engaging. I've said before that the Poetic Edda is probably the most incorrupt of all the sources we have for surviving mythology, but even here, in the very first stanza of the very first poem, we've already run into something a little weird and ambiguous and sort of hard to decipher. And this is characteristic of the mythology as a whole, as it's been handed down to us in our time. Here's that stanza again in English. Hearing, I ask, from all the tribes, greater and lesser, the offspring of Heimdall. Father of the slain, you wished me well to declare living beings ancient stories, the ones I remember from furthest back. The English translation I've used here is by Carolyne Larrington from her second edition Poetic Edda published in 2014. Like any translator, Professor Larrington has had to make decisions about some of the trickier words in Old Norse, the language that our core mythological sources were written in. Some of these words don't have direct translations in modern English, and in this case, we're dealing with one word in particular that was already archaic and hard to understand in the Old Norse language by the time it was physically written down in the 13th century. That word is Valfóður, which is used here as a name for the god Odin. Larrington translated this word into the phrase father of the slain, which is the traditional solution to this problem. But the problem is that nobody really knows for sure what the second piece of the compound, fóður, originally meant. Val is a word we see used all over the place and is very clearly a reference to a dead body on a battlefield. But fóður only ever shows up in archaic compounds, and even though at face value it does sound a little like father, it's not the common Old Norse word for father. That word is fadir. To the untrained ear, these words may sound pretty similar, but to a Norse person's ear, they would have sounded as different as bent and banter or moth and mother. The problem we have in interpreting this word is that Norse society didn't have a robust literary tradition during the pagan era, and by the time Christians got around to writing down some of the stories that had been passed down through recited poetry for hundreds of years, they were already dealing with words and phrases that had fallen out of use long ago, and were forced to make their best guesses at interpretation. So, ever since then, this word fóður has been interpreted as father, which could be correct, and does mirror an ancient Greek tradition of converting the word pater to patros when used in some compounds. But there's also a possible case to be made that it might not have meant father. My favorite alternate theory about the meaning behind this word is that it could be related to the Old English word fadian, which meant to arrange or direct or to guide or to set in order, which works well as a description for everything Odin does. If it's true, and that's admittedly a decently sized if, the implication is that certain names for Odin, like Father of the Slain and even the more famous Allfather, should actually be translated as arranger or orderer of the slain and all-orderer. The reason I bring this up is because from our modern, Western, Christianity-influenced cultural mindset, we are already predisposed to thinking of a god as a father figure. And someone who orders and directs and arranges all things, especially one who has a creator role, as Odin does, is an easy metaphor for a father figure. But it's important to remember that people who lived over 1,000 years ago had very different mindsets than we do, and would have seen the world in very different ways. So even if fóður does mean father, we ought to think through these things and be careful about not imposing our modern point of view onto ancient Norse people when we read these stories and try to interpret what they mean from a religious or cultural perspective. As the poem Våluspá begins, the god Odin has just temporarily resurrected a dead seeress in order to ask her questions about fate and about the future. Odin is obsessed with knowledge, or more specifically, wisdom. But when we see the word wisdom used in these poems, it's often used synonymously with both intelligence and knowledge, concepts that we often regard as being different in some way in our time, but are always just termed wisdom in the poetry. In any case, Odin is obsessed with this kind of all-encompassing wisdom, and he is willing to go to extreme lengths to acquire it. He will break gender taboos to get it. He will permanently sacrifice parts of his own body to get it. He will even offer himself up as a human sacrifice to himself in order to get it. In this case, he's just woken up a dead woman who knew magic so that he could ask her about the future, something that she knew, but he himself did not. This is fascinating because in modern times, and especially in the West, most of our brains don't have a good frame of reference for ideas about deity that didn't originate with Abrahamic religions. We tend to think of a divine figure as one with omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, wherein they know everything, can do anything, and are everywhere all at once. But this is not true of Norse gods. They are, of course, extremely powerful, but they have limitations. They are not infinitely powerful. Odin cannot see the future of his own accord. He's got to ask someone else. Although there are certain others of the Norse gods who can, Odin is not one of them. In fact, he can't see everything that's happening in the world all at once either. Instead, he has two ravens named Hugin and Munin, who fly all over the world observing events and then report back to him. His throne, Hlidskjolf, is geographically positioned in a place that allows him to overlook all the realms of the world, but he cannot just know everything all at once by virtue of his own power. So Odin resurrects this dead seeress in Våluspá and begins by asking her to tell him living beings' ancient stories. And she answers him with the most ancient thing she can recall. Quote, "I remember giants born in early time. Those nurtured me long ago. I remember 9 worlds. I remember 9 giant women, the mighty measuring tree below the earth." End quote. The seeress tells us here that she was nurtured long ago by giants. So it's not too crazy to imagine that she herself may be a member of this group commonly called giants. So we should talk about what giants really are in Norse mythology. The word that is translated to giant here is Jotun in the singular and Jotnar in the plural. It's a word that does not literally mean gigantic in size. It comes from an older root in a language called Proto-Germanic that would have been the ancestor of all the Germanic languages, including English and German and Dutch and Norwegian and Swedish and Danish and Icelandic and all these other related languages, as well as all of their more recent ancestors like Old Norse. And the root in Proto-Germanic from which Jotun comes is etunaz, or something along those lines. It's not a word we've ever seen written down. It's a word we've had to reconstruct, since Proto-Germanic was never really written down except for maybe a few inscriptions here and there that show up right around the time Proto-Germanic is evolving into Proto-Norse. But etunaz is a noun form of the verb etanal, which means to eat. So a Jotun is something that eats, and is very likely an overeater or a gluttonous character of some kind. And this class of characters that we've come to refer to as giants so commonly were never necessarily thought of as gigantic as a class by original Norse pagans. Every once in a while, a gigantic one does come along, just like every once in a while, one with many heads comes along, or one that's shaped like an eagle, or one that looks both half alive and half the deathly color of a corpse. But on average, there are stories wherein these so-called giants do things like eat apples, ride horses, and interact with human beings without ever giving us any reason to believe that they are outside the bounds of potential human size. And in fact, neither the Jotnar nor the gods are ever described as being visually indistinguishable from humans. Jotnar are sometimes described as being a little bit larger than humans in some of the later sagas, probably just because bigger usually equals better and more powerful in the Norse mindset. Every hero, for example, is always described as the tallest, strongest, most athletic man around, and supernatural creatures will sometimes have that description applied to them as well, just by virtue of the fact that we are supposed to understand them as powerful. So going forward, I will probably try to avoid the word giants very often, as I find it to be misleading and frankly incorrect, although it may still come out of my mouth every now and then as part of a translation I'm reading or for other similar reasons. There's actually an Old English version of this word too, eoten, which shows up in the story of Beowulf and ended up becoming etin in Middle English, but we sort of lost this word by the time modern English came around, so for the most part, I will try to stick with using the Norse word jotun as much as possible. The next thing the seeress tells us is that she remembers 9 worlds. What she doesn't tell us is that she remembers the 9 worlds. This may seem like a trivial point at first, but the lack of a definitive marker there can make a world of difference. For example, imagine that I said the phrase, "On my way home today, I saw 9 flowers." There's no definitive marker there, no word like the, these, or those. So there could be any number of flowers in existence, and I just happened to see 9 of them. There's also no information in that phrase telling you which flowers I saw. On the other hand, if I were to say, "On my way home today, I saw the 9 flowers," now it becomes clear that I'm talking about some specific, discrete group of 9 flowers that you and I are both aware of. Throughout the entire corpus of source material that we have, we never see the phrase "the 9 worlds" being used, and we are never given a list of what they are. Post-Christianization, when we start to see Icelanders writing about stories that had been passed down to them, we do start to see phrases like "the 9th world," for example, used here and there. And some modern scholars have proposed lists of what they believe those 9 worlds might be, assuming there are only 9. But it's really anyone's guess as far as how well those lists actually conform to the way cosmology was defined in ancient times. One scholar, Peter Schjødt, wrote a fascinating paper on this back in 1992. It's written in Danish, so good luck to all my English-speaking friends. But Schjødt makes the argument that the 9 worlds remembered by the seeress are not spatial worlds, but temporal worlds. In other words, that they are different ages of the past that have come and gone. But that's how ambiguous these 9 worlds are. There's so little information on them in the sources that we aren't even sure if they are regions in space or ages in time. To me, what's a little more interesting than trying to label these 9 worlds is digging into the constant religious use of the number 9 generally all over the sources. Rudolf Simek put together a great summary of instances where 9 is used in his Dictionary of Northern Mythology. Apart from the phrase 9 worlds, there is a story where Odin hangs from a tree for 9 nights, another god, Heimdallr, had 9 mothers, Freyr is forced to wait 9 nights before he can be married. Another set of 8 nights, which probably just means 9 days, is also the timeline for the goddess Freyja's proposed betrothal to the Jotun Thrym. The god Njörður and his wife Skadi have homes in 2 different locations, and they alternate their living arrangement every 9 days. Odin has a magic golden ring that produces 9 more golden rings every 9 nights. The beautiful maiden Menglöð is served by 9 other handmaidens. Ægir, a Jotun of the sea, has 9 daughters, and Thor takes exactly 9 steps after his fight with a gigantic serpent at Ragnarok before he finally collapses and dies. Whenever we see a group of things, there seem to always be 9 of them, or 3 if we need a very small group. It's entirely possible then that the phrase 9 worlds may have just been a poetic way of saying all of the worlds, without any real need to nail down exactly which worlds we're talking about. We can't say for sure, but it could easily have been just as ambiguous to the Norse as it is to us. In any case, there is no solid evidence that they believed in a canonical, listed out, and named set of 9 worlds. On that note, if you've ever seen a drawing or a diagram of 9 worlds situated throughout branches of a giant cosmic tree, that is a modern invention as well, and it seems to have come from another strange word the seeress uses in this stanza. The original phrase in question is niumana heima íviði. Larrington translated this as, "I remember 9 worlds, I remember 9 giant women." That first piece, "I remember 9 worlds," isn't an issue, but the problem is the last word, íviði, which is effectively a hapax legomenon, meaning it only occurs once, organically, in any of the texts, and that makes it very hard for us to figure out exactly what it means. From certain angles, it looks a lot like it might mean something like in the woods or in a tree, which is how some translators render it, and probably why there are so many drawings floating around that depict little planets among branches of a tree. But it's peculiar enough to be questionable. Jens Peter Schjødt, who I mentioned earlier, takes the phrase íviði to be a reference to roots of a tree. Larrington's interpretation is more traditional, though it is likely based on the assumption that íviði has something to do with the 9 mothers of Heimdallr, or puts a lot of trust in a much later source that lists íviði as a name for troll women. In any case, we don't know for sure, and for that reason, different translations of the ancient texts will sometimes say wildly different things. Joseph S. Hopkins, a current scholar who operates the website mimisbrunner.info, has started putting together a project called the Comparative Våluspá, illustrating the various ways this poem has been translated by different scholars. One thing to note, however, is that there absolutely is a tree. The last thing the seeress mentions in this stanza is the mighty measuring tree below the earth, and admittedly, that phrase below the earth is weird. Schjødt suggested that this could be a reference to a tree in seed form before it's grown. But one of the things you start to realize as you get used to how things are said in the Old Norse sources is that you don't always have to take these sorts of words like under and over and below as literally as we would take them today. There's decent reason to believe the tree mentioned here wasn't thought to be physically underneath the earth, which we'll get to more in the next episode. The seeress goes on to tell us that, quote, "Early in time, Ymir made his settlement. There was no sand, nor sea, nor cool waves. Earth was nowhere, nor the sky above. A void of yawning chaos. Grass was there nowhere." End quote. This stanza gives us our first insight into what the universe was like before the gods existed. There was this yawning void of nothingness. In the Old Norse, it's called ginnungagap. And it's in this nothingness that the first being, Ymir, makes a settlement, whatever that means. But at this point, Våluspá starts to assume that the audience has a basic knowledge of how the earth was made that we may not actually have yet. So we're going to turn to a 13th century source from Iceland to help supplement our information. At this point in time in Iceland, Christianity has been in full effect for hundreds of years. However, a lot of the old pagan poems have still managed to be passed down orally from generation to generation, and the church in Iceland has not been so aggressive as to try and completely stamp this material out. And in fact, Icelanders are becoming pretty nostalgic about what they view as this quaint past of theirs. And there's a particular chieftain named Snorri Sturluson, also a historian and poet himself, who decides he's going to consolidate all the material he can find and put it into a guide for composing the poetry of his ancestors. Today, this guide is often called the Prose Edda, and the first half of it, called Gylfaginning, tells the story of a Swedish king named Gylfi, who goes in disguise to a city in Sweden that Snorri has named Oskarðr after the home of the gods in the mythology, and has a conversation with 3 wizards there who take turns explaining Norse mythology to him. When Gylfi arrives, he introduces himself under this disguised name Gangleri, and is introduced to 3 characters who are all sitting on thrones, each one higher up than the last, and their names are High, just as high, and Third. In Old Norse, these are Hor, Javenhor, and Þriði. The very first question Gangleri asks them is, who is the highest and most ancient of all gods? And of course, they answer him, Odin. They tell him that Odin is called Allfather in their language, which you will of course see translated as All-Father most of the time, but that he also has 12 other names, which is a little bit silly because there are actually more than 200 unique names for Odin that we've been able to tally up from the sources. But these characters list off 12 names and explain that Odin lives throughout all ages and rules all things and made heaven and earth and the skies and everything in them. But Gangleri is more interested in learning about what Odin was doing before all that. Before that, these characters, who I'll call the Highs, tell him, Odin was among the Hrimthursar, which means something like frost monsters or frost ogres. This word is usually translated as frost giants because Thursar and Jotnar are often used interchangeably within the sources, and I suppose if we're already mistranslating Jotnar as giants, then we might as well mistranslate Thursar as giants too. In any case, Gangleri presses for more information here, so the Hais quote stanza 3 of Våluspá to him about the absence of earth and Ginnungagap, and then begin elaborating that a place called Niflheim was made many ages before the earth was made, and that in its midst there are 3 rivers. One of these rivers is located near the gates of the underworld, which the sources often call Hell, with one L. It's not a reference to the Christian hell. This word Niflheim literally translates to mist home, or mist world or realm. Heim can mean home, but it can also refer to an entire world, or even to a region of geography within a larger area. But on the other side of Ginnungagap, specifically the southern side, there was another region called Muspel. Muspel is bright and hot and burning with flames, making it impassable for anyone who isn't native to it. But even if you tried, it's guarded on the frontier by a being called Surtur, who wields a flaming sword, and at the end of the world, Våluspá prophesies that Surtur will wage war against the gods and defeat them, after which he will burn the whole world with fire. Gangleri now shifts focus back to what conditions were like in this primordial time, and the Hais respond that the rivers flowing out of Niflheim are poisonous, and are accompanied by a poisonous vapor. As they flowed outward from their source and approached Ginnungagap, they began to freeze, and the vapor rising off of them created a rime on the top of the ice as it froze as well, which increased layer by layer and continued to stretch across the gap. When the rime began approaching the heat and molten sparks from Muspel on the southerly side, it began to melt, and eventually formed the shape of a man who became Ymir, the first being. At this point, Ymir was presumably alone in the universe, floating around in the gap or maybe walking along the frozen rime, somehow making a settlement in this place, as the seeress said. But the Hais are very clear when explaining to Gangleri about Ymir that he is not considered a god, specifically because he was evil and because his descendants, the Hrimthursar, are also evil. If you're wondering how a being who is alone in the universe can somehow have evil descendants, or descendants of any kind, it's because Ymir is an asexual reproducer, able to generate a man and a woman by the sweat of his left armpit, and another man by means of his legs mating with each other in some way. As the Hais explain it, this is the origin of the clan of Hrimthursar. And it's worth noting, as a primer for a future episode about concepts of gender and sexuality among the Norse, that even though he reproduces asexually, Ymir is referred to as a man and with masculine pronouns consistently in the sources. The Hais also explain that as the rime continued to melt and drip, it also formed a cow whose milk provided sustenance for Ymir, allowing him to survive. The cow's name was Auðumla, and it survived by licking the salty rhinestones. Over the course of 3 days, as it licked these stones, it licked out the shape of another man. This second man's name is Buri, and he is beautiful and big and powerful, which is characteristic of the good guy in any Norse story worth its salt. In this case, Buri is going to be the progenitor of the gods, but in order for this to happen, he must first take a wife and have a son, which he does, and which immediately begs the question, where did Buri's wife come from? The sources don't tell us who she was specifically, but they have enumerated all of the beings in existence by this point. And the only women in the universe are numbered among Ymir's descendants. They are all Hrimthursar. So we can assume that Buri's wife must have been taken from among that group. The son of Buri and the unnamed Hrimthurs is sometimes listed as Bur, sometimes as Bor. I prefer Bor because it's a bit more distinct from his father's name, Buri. But Bor also takes a wife, also presumably a member of the Hrimthursar, and they have 3 sons whose names are Odin, Vili, and Ve. An important takeaway here is that all 3 primordial creatures all came from the same place, which was this poisonous rime formed from the rivers flowing out of Niflheim. Genetically, if you want to look at it that way, they're not so different from each other, although one of them is admittedly cow-shaped while the other 2 are man-shaped. But this second man, the good one, Buri, produces descendants who are as much descended from Ymir as they are from himself. What this means is that Odin, who is referred to as a god, is not a different kind of being than these Hrimthursar who come from Ymir. His mother is one, his grandmother is one, and his grandfather came from the same stuff Ymir came from. Modern retellings of these stories like to present the gods and the Jotnar, or Thursar, giants as they like to call them, as different types of beings, where the gods usually look like human beings and the giants are usually enormous and have some outlandish appearance like bright blue skin and maybe rocks or icicles all over their faces. But we don't have any descriptions like that in the actual mythology. As far as we know, these beings, both gods and Jotnar, are fundamentally the same. They are at least compatible enough that they intermarry all the time. We see it here from the very beginning, and produce offspring with each other. The mother of one of Odin's sons, the god Thor, is also named as being a Jotun. Both groups interact with humans on occasion and sometimes are completely indistinguishable from average humans until they choose to reveal their identities. Another important takeaway here relates to the names of the three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Their names are actually a clue to deciphering how old this story is, or at least how old certain elements of it are. When we trace back all of these names to their reconstructed origins in Proto-Germanic, we discover that at this point in linguistic history, all three names alliterate. Whereas in Old Norse, Odin's name has lost an initial consonant due to some sound change patterns, which caused it to lose its ability to alliterate with the other two. In Proto-Germanic, the three names are Woðunas, Weljon, and Wihon. This, combined with the fact that there are some Old English phrases and toponyms in England that seem to reflect this same pattern, indicate that whereas we are sometimes tempted to think of Norse mythology as something intrinsic to the Viking Age, elements of that mythology have been around much, much longer and are part of a religious tradition shared by other pagan Germanic groups outside of Scandinavia. We also see Odin showing up in a group of three in various other contexts spread out across all of that territory, one of which is that three of his alternate names are High, just as High, and Third, which, of course, are the names Snorri gave to the three characters Gangleri speaks with in Gylfaginning. When Gangleri asks how well these two primordial clans of beings got along with each other, the Highs respond that Odin and his brothers killed Ymir and built the rest of the cosmos out of parts of his body. Presumably, we should understand this act of murder with no real context given in light of Snorri's claim that Ymir was evil. But as we'll soon discover, Odin is no shimmering beacon of modern-day virtue himself. But before we get into any of Odin's other questionable decisions, we need to talk about the most, quote, loving thing he's ever done, bestowing life upon mankind. Next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include a Handbook of Germanic Etymology by Vladimir Orel, 2003, Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2010. I'm not going to get this right because I can't pronounce Danish to save my life, but heima, íviði, miåtvið, mæran, neðan, Tid og Rum i Våluspá 2 by Peter Schjødt, 1992, the Poetic Edda translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995. And let me just apologize one more time to my Danish friends for the way I horribly butchered the title of that paper by Schjødt. Thank you.